that we're going to be focusing on in today's deep dive is one particular card in this game
Right.
that's actually created a lot of debate and discussion and even some controversy. And that is the Newton Knight card.
Interesting.
So Newton Knight was a real person. He was a historical figure, and we're going to talk all about him and his life and his actions and why his inclusion in this game, the way he's depicted in this game, is so interesting to people who both play the game and just people who are interested in history.
Yeah.
So to kind of get us started, maybe you can tell us a little bit about who Newton Knight was and why he's a figure that we should be talking about.
Sure. So Newton Knight was a white farmer from Mississippi.
Okay.
And he's a very interesting and kind of unexpected figure in the history of the Civil War.
Okay.
He's kind of known as this Southern Unionist, this anti-slavery figure who emerges from, the Deep South during the Civil War.
That's pretty unexpected.
Yeah, it is. It is.
When you think about Mississippi during the Civil War, you think about very much pro-Confederacy, pro-slavery.
Right, exactly. And so Knight's story is really fascinating because it kind of complicates that narrative.
Okay.
So, he starts out actually initially joining the Confederacy,
Yeah.
But then he becomes disillusioned with the war and with the Confederacy, and particularly with the institution of slavery. And so he actually deserts the Confederate Army and forms his own band of fellow deserters.
Wow.
Called the Knight Company. And they actively fight against the Confederacy.
So this is during the Civil War.
During the Civil War.
He is actively fighting against the Confederate Army.
Yes.
Wow.
And they're really interesting because they control a portion of Mississippi.
Okay.
For a time, they actually declared Jones County, Mississippi as a free state of Jones.
Wow.
And so this is really significant because it's this pocket of resistance.
Right in the heart of the Confederacy.
Right in the heart of the Confederacy.
Yeah.
This area where, slavery is so entrenched and the Confederate cause is, so strong.
And he's basically saying no to that.
He's saying no to that. He's actively fighting against it.
Wow. So how does this then tie back into the board game that we were talking about, Heritage Owl's Underground Railroad?
Yeah. So in the game, there's this Newton Knight card. And when players use this card, it allows them to do certain things in the game that represent Knight's actions in real life. So, for example, players can use the Newton Knight card to quickly move escaped slaves to the Free State of Jones.
Okay, so they can kind of like bypass.
They can bypass
some of the dangers of the Underground Railroad by going to this safe haven.
Right, because the Free State of Jones is depicted in the game as a safe haven for escaped slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And so players can also use the Newton Knight card to protect safe houses.
Okay.
From slave catchers and things like that.
Okay, so his actions are represented in this game.
Yes.
In a way that allows the players to kind of embody his.
Yeah, to embody his spirit of resistance.
Yeah.
And his efforts to help enslaved people.
So now the interesting thing about this, and the thing that I know has caused a lot of debate and discussion, is that there's another card in this game, the John Brown card.
Right.
And John Brown, of course, was another very famous abolitionist.
Yes.
But using the John Brown card in the game comes with penalties.
Mm-hmm.
It comes with risks.
Right.
So the question then becomes, why does the Newton Knight card, which represents someone who also used violence to achieve his goals,
right,
why does that card not have any penalties attached to it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's something that the game designers have talked about quite a bit.
Okay.
And there's no easy answer to that question, but one of the things that they've pointed to is the historical context.
Right.
So John Brown's actions, like the raid on Harper's Ferry, took place before the Civil War.
Yeah.
And so, at that time, slavery was still very much legal, and the nation was not at war.
Right.
Whereas Newton Knight was operating during the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And so the designers argue that, Knight's actions were taking place within the context of a war.
Right.
Where violence was already, rampant and kind of,
it's dismissed by the government.
Exactly. Yeah. And so they make this distinction between Brown's actions, which they see as kind of, preemptive violence,
okay,
and Knight's actions, which they see as taking place within the context of a war.
Okay, so in a way, they're saying that Newton Knight was already operating within a system that was violent.
Yes.
And so his use of violence is not as as problematic
Yes.
or as worthy of penalty
Yes.
as John Brown's actions.
Right. And it's not to say that they condone violence.
Right.
But they're trying to make a distinction between, the context in which those actions were taking place.
Okay.
And, it's a really interesting debate because I think, it raises questions about, how we judge historical figures, and how we think about violence and morality and all those sorts of things.
And how do those things then translate into a game?
Exactly. How do you represent that in a game?
Because in a game, you have to make choices about, who to include and who not to include and what actions to represent and what actions to penalize.
Right.
And so I think this is a really interesting example of how a game can actually force us to confront these really difficult questions.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's so fascinating about games, that they can bring history to life. In a way that, textbooks and lectures sometimes can't.
Because you're forced to make choices.
You're forced to make choices.
You're forced to kind of embody these historical figures in a way.
Exactly.
And that can be really challenging and thought-provoking.
Yeah, and I think in the case of Newton Knight, he's such a complex figure.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, he's this hero. He's this this rebel who's fighting against slavery.
Yeah.
But he's also, flawed figure.
Right.
He's someone who, used violence.
Yeah.
And had his own, personal struggles and contradictions.
And I think it's also important to remember that, he lived in a time and place where, the options available to him
Right.
were very limited.
Right.
And so, I think it's hard to judge him too harshly
I agree.
by our modern standards.
Right.
But I think it's important to acknowledge the complexity of his story.
Exactly.
And to recognize that, he was a product of his time. But he was also someone who was willing to challenge the prevailing system.
Yes.
And to fight for what he believed in.
Yes.
And that's something that I think we can all admire.
I agree.
Even if we don't agree with all of his methods.
Right.
So I think that's a really interesting thing that this game brings up.
Yeah.
And I think it's a question that, is worth thinking about, even if you're not a board game player. If you're interested in history, if you're interested in, the Civil War, if you're interested in these kinds of questions about how we judge historical figures, this is definitely a story that's worth checking out.
And a game that's worth checking out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think on that note, we're going to wrap up today's deep dive.
Okay.
But I think this is a really interesting conversation starter. And I hope that it encourages people to learn more about Newton Knight.
Me too.
And to think about these really complex questions about, how we judge the past and how we represent the past.
And I would even add to that question, if you were designing a game like this, how would you handle this?
Yeah.
How would you represent Newton Knight? How would you represent John Brown? What choices would you make?
Yeah, would you include those cards? Would you leave them out? Would you change them?
Right.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting questions here.
Lots to think about.
And we hope that you'll join us next time for another deep dive into the past.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been great talking to you.
Likewise.
All right.
See you later.
Bye.